Malaria is older than empires. It has stalked armies through swamps, hollowed out villages, shaped borders, and quietly killed more human beings than most wars ever could. Even now, after satellites, gene sequencing, and miracle headlines, malaria still finds ways back in. It doesn't announce itself like a plague from a movie. It comes as fever, chills, sweats, weakness. And then, if the wrong strain bites you at the wrong time, it comes as silence. For decades, the modern world had tried to solve malaria the way it solves everything, with industrial chemistry, centralized production, and a controlled supply chain. And for a while, it worked. Drugs like chloroquine looked like a final answer: cheap, effective, scalable. But nature adapts faster than institutions. By the mid 20th century, the parasite was evolving resistance. The cure was slipping. And the disease, as it always has, was waiting patiently for the moment people got complacent. Here's the strange part: the solution wasn't new. It wasn't futuristic. It wasn't born inside a corporate laboratory. It had been written down, almost casually, in ancient texts. It grew from dirt. The plant is called Artemisia annua, sweet wormwood, a weed by the standards of modern agriculture. The kind of plant that doesn't ask permission to grow. It thrives on the edges, roadsides, abandoned lots, neglected fields. And yet, inside its leaves is one of the most effective anti-malarial compounds ever discovered, artemisinin. That discovery would eventually win a Nobel Prize, but the story of how it was found and what happened after doesn't feel like a clean celebration of science. It feels like a warning about how the world treats medicine that can't be owned. Long before artemisinin had a name, people in China had a word for the plant: Qinghao. For centuries, it appeared in traditional medical writings, associated with fevers, especially intermittent fevers, the kind that rise and fall like a tide. If you know malaria, you know that rhythm. The body heats up, breaks down, cools off, then repeats. The disease comes in waves, like something alive is timing your suffering. But in the modern era, knowledge that isn't verified inside institutions tends to become invisible. It doesn't matter if something worked for 1,000 years if it wasn't catalogued in the right language, tested in the right buildings, stamped by the right authorities. Traditional remedies were often treated like folklore, unreliable at best, dangerous at worst. Then, history forced a re-evaluation. During the Vietnam War era, malaria became a strategic problem. Soldiers weren't just dying from bullets, they were being taken out by infection, fevers ripping through bodies in jungle conditions where mosquitoes controlled the night. Standard treatments were failing, drug resistance was spreading, and when an empire can't keep its troops alive, alternative knowledge stops being quaint. It becomes necessary. So China launched a secretive research program, Project 523, not a wellness trend, not a marketing campaign, a wartime effort to find something that worked, fast. Scientists were told to search everywhere, including old medical texts. And deep in the historical record, they found repeated references to Qinghao for fever. But early attempts were disappointing. Extracts weren't reliably effective. It looked at first like another dead end, another example of why modern institutions dismiss plant medicine. And then, someone made a different decision. Instead of boiling the plant like a tea, they tried to extract it at lower temperatures, closer to how ancient instructions implied it should be prepared. That detail matters more than most people realize. Because artemisinin is sensitive, heat can destroy it. If you boil the plant aggressively, you can ruin the very compound you're trying to capture. The ancient texts weren't being poetic. They were being precise, in a language that modern science almost misread. And that is how the weed began to reveal its secret. Not by being reinvented, but by being listened to. When artemisinin was isolated and tested properly, it didn't just work. It worked dramatically. It attacked malaria parasites quickly, reducing the parasite load with a speed that made older drugs look slow. It wasn't a mild improvement. It was a different league. This wasn't just another pharmaceutical product. It was a rediscovered biological weapon against one of humanity's oldest killers. Millions of lives have been saved because of artemisinin-based therapies. Entire regions saw malaria death rates drop. In time, the world recognized the magnitude of this breakthrough, and eventually, the Nobel Prize came, awarded for a discovery rooted, unmistakably, in a plant and an ancient record of human observation. But here's where the story changes tone. Because the moment something becomes valuable, systems move in. Regulation, ownership, patents, supply chains, approved forms, unapproved forms. The same institutions that once dismissed traditional knowledge begin to reframe it, not as shared human inheritance, but as a product category. Artemisinin becomes artemisinin-based combination therapy. Artemisia annua becomes not recommended. The leaf becomes suspicious. The extract becomes legitimate. And suddenly you're left with a haunting question. If the life-saving compound comes from a common plant, why are we warned not to use the plant itself? The official answers sound responsible. Dosage control, purity, safety, consistency. And those concerns aren't imaginary. Plants vary by region, soil, harvest time, storage. People can misidentify herbs. People can take too much. People can hurt themselves. That's true, but it's not the whole truth. Because the deeper issue isn't only safety, it's control. A plant that anyone can grow in a backyard is a medicine that resists monopoly. It doesn't fit neatly into a system built on proprietary distribution. You can't lock it behind a supply contract the same way you lock a pill behind a patent. And so the narrative tightens. Don't use the whole plant. Only use approved pharmaceuticals. Only use standardized extracts. The public is trained to distrust what they can touch, harvest, and prepare themselves. A Nobel Prize weed framed as a danger. And that contradiction is where this story truly begins. To understand the conflict around Artemisia annua, you have to understand how modern medicine decides what counts as real. It isn't just about whether something works, it's about whether it can be measured, packaged, and regulated inside systems designed for products. Systems that speak in trials, approvals, and manufacturing consistency. Artemisinin fits that world perfectly when it's extracted, purified, and dosed into a standardized drug. But Artemisia, the living plant, doesn't. It's variable. It's messy. It's personal. And worst of all, it's accessible. This is where the story takes on an institutional tension that most documentaries skip. Not an outright conspiracy, but a structural bias. If a compound can be isolated and sold, it becomes medicine. If the same compound exists in a leaf that grows freely, it becomes a supplement, an unregulated herb, or a potential risk. And the consequences are enormous. Because in many parts of the world, access to malaria treatment is not guaranteed. Supply chains break, clinics run out, prices fluctuate, conflict zones don't get deliveries on time, and when people are desperate, they do what humans have always done. They reach for what they can grow. This is why Artemisia annua became controversial in global health policy. Some groups promoted the plant as a tea or dried leaf treatment, something communities could cultivate themselves. On the surface, that sounds like resilience, self-sufficiency, a local answer to a local threat. But institutions warned against it, and the warnings were sharp. One key fear was resistance. Artemisinin is powerful, but the parasite can adapt. If people use the plant in inconsistent doses, too weak, too sporadic, they may expose malaria parasites to sublethal pressure, training them to survive. In other words, weak artemisinin could create stronger malaria. That concern is scientifically plausible, and it's a legitimate reason for caution. Yet, even that argument contains an uncomfortable implication. The safest model is one where the public is dependent on centralized supply. The plant becomes a threat, not because it doesn't work, but because it works outside the controlled framework. And then, quietly, another conflict emerges, one that has nothing to do with malaria and everything to do with perception. Wormwood has a reputation, not Artemisia annua specifically, but wormwood in general, especially Artemisia absinthium, the bitter herb historically used in absinthe. For over a century, wormwood has been wrapped in myths, madness, hallucinations, moral decay, poisoned artists stumbling through Parisian nights. The truth is more boring and more instructive. Much of the old absinthe panic was exaggeration layered on top of it, alcohol abuse, poor manufacturing, and social fear, but reputations stick. And once a plant is culturally labeled as dangerous, it becomes easier to dismiss other species in the same family, even when they are chemically distinct. So a strange blending happens in the public mind. Wormwood becomes that toxic thing. And when institutions warn against Artemisia teas, the warning feels intuitive, almost preloaded. People rarely stop to ask, which wormwood? Which compound? Which dose? Which history? This is how misinformation and bureaucracy reinforce each other. Not by plotting in a room, but by letting old narratives do the work. Meanwhile, artemisinin continues to be hailed, correctly, as one of the most important anti-malarial breakthroughs ever. It becomes a pillar of modern malaria treatment. And as demand rises, production becomes its own battlefield. Artemisinin originally came from the plant. That means fields, growers, harvest seasons, extraction facilities, and agriculture doesn't scale like chemistry. You can't instantly manufacture a harvest in response to market demand. You have to plant months ahead. You have to predict global need. When those predictions fail, prices spike. When they overcorrect, farmers suffer. This volatility triggered a major push to produce artemisinin through semi-synthetic methods, using engineered processes to make the compound more reliably. Again, on paper, this sounds like progress. A stable supply, less dependence on crops, faster response to outbreaks. But every step away from the plant is also a step toward tighter industrial control. And that matters because the plant doesn't only contain artemisinin, it contains a whole chemistry set, flavonoids and related compounds that may influence how the body absorbs and responds. Some researchers and herbal practitioners argue that the whole plant could have broader anti-parasitic effects or different pharmacological behavior than the isolated compound alone. Not necessarily better, but different, more complex, less understood. And complexity is the enemy of the modern medical marketplace. Complexity can't be patented easily. Complexity can't be reduced to a single trademarked molecule. So the world does what it always does. It narrows the story. Artemisinin becomes the hero. The plant becomes an inconvenience. But once you start watching the pattern, you see it everywhere. Knowledge extracted from traditional systems, purified into a product, then returned to the public with the original context stripped away. The people who carried the knowledge are called unscientific, while the institutions that monetize the isolated result are called innovators. Even the Nobel Prize narrative, as triumphant as it is, fits inside this tension. The prize celebrates discovery, but it doesn't necessarily celebrate the deeper reality. That observation, tradition, and survival knowledge can be correct long before institutions agree. Now the story expands beyond malaria, because Artemisia annua has been studied for other potentials, parasites beyond malaria, immune-related effects, even exploratory cancer research. Much of this is preliminary, uneven, and often overstated online. And that's exactly what gives institutions ammunition. Hype becomes the excuse to dismiss the entire category. But here's the catch. Just because something is hyped doesn't mean it's meaningless. It just means the subject is politically and economically sensitive. People want a miracle. Institutions want control. And in the middle is a plant that grows like it doesn't care what anyone wants. The question becomes less about whether Artemisia annua is safe or dangerous, and more about who gets to decide what you're allowed to do with living medicine. If a community can grow part of its own healthcare, the dependency model weakens. And when dependency weakens, industries, pharmaceutical, agricultural, even regulatory, feel the ground shift beneath them. That's the real tension. Not a villain twirling a mustache, but a system that cannot comfortably tolerate self sufficiency. By the time you reach the modern era of Artemisia annua, the plant has already lived 3 lives. First, as a humble fever remedy recorded in old Chinese medical writing, knowledge passed down not through journals, but through survival. Second, as a wartime rediscovery, pulled from history because modern drugs were failing, and failure has a way of making people suddenly respectful. And third, as a global commodity, its most valuable molecule extracted, standardized, and folded into the machinery of modern medicine. But the fourth life is the one that matters most to the audience listening right now. Artemisia as a symbol. A living example of what happens when a remedy can't be easily owned. In official messaging, the line is simple. Use artemisinin-based combination therapies. Don't rely on Artemisia teas or whole plant preparations for malaria. Again, there is real science behind the need for combination therapy. Artemisinin alone can fail if misused. Resistance is a legitimate danger. Malaria is not a disease you want to experiment with casually, and yet the public isn't blind. People notice patterns. They notice when substances are dismissed until they become profitable. They notice when unsafe becomes safe the moment it's repackaged. They notice when communities are told the best path forward is to remain dependent. So the story becomes emotional, not just intellectual. Because this isn't only about malaria. It's about autonomy. It's about a future where supply chains fracture, trust collapses, and people begin asking old questions again. What grows here? What heals? What did we forget? If you zoom out, Artemisia annua sits in the same category as countless other plants and practices that existed in a grey zone, too effective to ignore, too ungovernable to fully embrace. And when something lives in that zone, it attracts two extremes: the institutions that warn against it, and the internet that hypes it as a cure-all. Both sides distort the truth in different ways. Institutions often speak as if the only safe knowledge is centralized knowledge, but history doesn't support that arrogance. Humans survived for millennia through observation and local adaptation. The problem wasn't that traditional knowledge was always wrong. The problem was that it wasn't always standardized, recorded, or protected from misuse. Meanwhile, the alternative world sometimes treats plants like magic. It turns promising research into suppressed cure and early evidence into certainty. That's not liberation. That's another form of manipulation, just in a different clothing. So, what's the grounded reality? The grounded reality is that Artemisia annua gave the world artemisinin, and artemisinin helped save millions. That is real. The grounded reality is that malaria parasites adapt, and misuse can drive resistance. That is real. The grounded reality is that modern systems prefer medicines that can be patented, regulated, and distributed through centralized channels. That is also real. And when you hold all three truths at once, the story stops being about a single plant and becomes about a repeating cycle: discovery, extraction, control, and narrative management. This is why the Nobel Prize weed feels so unsettling. Because the Nobel Prize signals legitimacy. It tells the public, this matters. This is proven. This is one of humanity's great medical achievements. But the word weed signals the opposite. It implies something unwanted, something that doesn't belong, something you should pull out and discard. Artemisia annua is both. a world-changing medicine source, and a plant the modern world doesn't quite want you to touch. So why are we warned not to use it? Maybe part of the answer is responsible caution. People can hurt themselves with plants, they can misidentify herbs, they can delay proper treatment, they can trust the wrong dosage at the wrong time. Malaria is not forgiving. But another part of the answer is that a plant based remedy threatens the clean boundaries institutions rely on: doctor and patient, manufacturer and consumer, approved and unapproved, legal and illegal, patented and unpatentable. A plant is messy in the way freedom is messy. It grows in places power doesn't control. And that is why, even when the science is real, the messaging becomes tense. The plant becomes discouraged. The conversation becomes dangerous. The public becomes misinformed for asking questions that are, at their core, deeply human. Here's the quiet call to action: not a demand to reject medicine, but a demand to remember. Learn the difference between hype and evidence. Learn the difference between a plant and a purified drug. Learn which stories were erased and which were simply forgotten. And if you care about resilience, real resilience, start rebuilding a relationship with the living world that isn't mediated entirely by corporations and institutions. Because the future may not look like the past, but the past still contains tools the future will need. And sometimes one of those tools is just a weed growing where no one thought to look.